Hi everyone, my name is Harveen Chiquetto and this is my applied assignment presentation for SPE 223. Here's the table of contents. First I'm going to go over the pre-work. I'm going to talk about the topic, why I chose it. I'm going to show you my research. I'm going to talk a little bit about the learning I've gained from this assignment, and then I'm going to provide some ideas about my continued inquiry and what I'd like to learn about, what I'd like to do with some of the information I've already learned from this assignment. And then I'll have some questions I will pose to the class. So we're going to start with the pre-work. So the topic I decided to do for this assignment is the challenges that educators face while trying to implement inclusion in the classroom. The reason I chose this is because I am an early childhood educator and I run a program that is an inclusive program that does have children with a range of special needs within classrooms of children who are their typical peers as well. And there are many challenges that my teachers face day to day. So I felt like this was a good opportunity for me to try to dig a little bit deeper. I did focus on elementary education because I'm not that familiar with it. My program is a 0 to 5 program. So I was hoping to gain more insight into what elementary ed teachers face in regards to implementing inclusion successfully. And teachers are expected to create these accessible, inclusive learning environments. They're supposed to benefit children with disabilities while balancing the needs of all the children in the classroom. So I just feel like there's a lot of expectations placed on the educator to ensure these successful outcomes for everyone. And sometimes it feels like they're expected to all of this, but they lack adequate support or resources to ensure these outcomes happen. And then the aspect of inclusion that I obviously am looking deeper into is education. So for my interview, I decided to interview Erin. She is a special educator for a local school district here in Arizona. And she specifically works with children with visual impairments. That population isn't very large, so she does also do children with other disabilities as well, but her specialty is working with children who have visual impairments. She has been working for the same school district for 28 years, so she has a wealth of knowledge and experience. I also feel like she's kind of seen the shifts in, in inclusion over the last 30 years, and I felt like she'd be someone who'd be really beneficial in providing some firsthand knowledge based on her experience about the challenges that she faces and other teachers face, maybe administrators. And I also wanted to get her perspective on her interactions with families as well too. Erin is also someone who I've known for over 20 years. She has referred students to my program that had learning disabilities, visual impairments. So we have worked together professionally in the past as well. And then I did also interview somebody else. I kind of wanted to sit down and have a conversation and find out the parent's perspective when it comes to having a child with a special need or a learning disability. This is my friend Nina. We are childhood friends. We've been friends for many, many years. And she is a parent of a child with a learning disability. So I remember going through the process with her and having casual conversations when she was trying to obtain a diagnosis and an IEP for her child. And I remember having very emotional conversations, but I never actually sat down and kind of, asked her questions about the process itself. So this was a great opportunity for me to understand what she really went through and the challenges and struggles she faced. So a little bit of background knowledge and experience. Through my work experience, I have seen firsthand how inclusive early childhood settings can be challenging for some children with certain disabilities. In early childhood specifically, especially due to the highly stimulating nature of early childhood classrooms, um, you know, it's usually play-based. There's a lot of different play themes going on. Kids are naturally louder, so when they're talking, their volume's a little bit raised. I mean, that can be a really challenging environment for a child who may get overstimulated pretty easily. I know as a teacher with a range of developmental needs in a classroom of even just typical kids, it can be challenging meeting those diverse needs of children. Obviously, I'm aware of limited resources, lack of training, and just group dynamics. Some years I've had a group of kiddos that just, it was seamless and smooth, and other years I had some interesting personalities that made that made the group of those kids together a challenging environment of in itself, just based on their personalities alone. And then I'm also very aware of implicit biases that teachers have that, obviously they're implicit because we don't always recognize that we have them. So I'm familiar with educators initially struggling to accept making changes in their classrooms or accommodations to meet certain needs because they kind of start off being resistant to the efficacy of them without even trying them. So the course materials that I used for this assignment, I used the article Equity, Parental Caregiver Power and Disability Policy in the U.S. context. And this article was it talks about the way schools handle disability services that are influenced by race and class, right? So it looks at how parents and caregivers can impact what services their children with disabilities receive, especially through the law known as IDEA, right? And one of the key points is that schools and educators often treat families differently based on their race or social standing. That can present a barrier for providing equitable, inclusive education and care to children. And then I chose the article that's Equity Gaps for Students with Disabilities and Perspectives on Urban Education. And it kind of echoed the same things as the other article that talked about, just provided deeper insights into how children with disabilities from a minority race and lower socioeconomic status are treated in contrast to their wealthier, whiter counterparts. My own research, the first article is called It's Just the Way I Learn, Inclusion from the Perspective of a Student with Visual Impairment. Since Erin specializes in children with visual impairments, I thought it was important to get some perspective from a student with that same disability and how inclusive practices have benefited their learning and education. The next article that I did for my research was inclusion from a general educator's perspective, preventing school failure. This was important because I have my research and information and knowledge from a special educator, but I also want to hear from a gen ed teacher and how the barriers and struggles that they face with inclusion in their classroom. And here is the evidence for my interview. Here is my evidence from my interview with Erin. On the right, you can see our emails exchange for our interview confirmation. And then on the left, you can see the questions I asked her and the notes from those questions. And here is the evidence from my interview with Nina, our email confirmation on the right, and you can see the questions and notes from my interview with her on the left screen here. Now I'm going to talk about the new learning I obtained from this applied assignment. So what I learned about inclusion in my interviews with Erin and Nina and the research I have done is that it's an incredibly complicated issue that goes just beyond putting students with disabilities into regular classrooms. It's about ensuring that specific needs are met, It's about schools making big changes in how they think about education and how they operate. Erin, who works with children who are visually impaired, talks about the collaboration that's needed between general education teachers and special education teachers. It has to be a team teaching environment to ensure the curriculum and the classroom environment are adjusted to support all students. Um, for Erin, getting students the help they need, especially with things like orientation and mobility training, is critical. And that really begins with early intervention and giving each student personalized support, right? So one of the things she talked about was infants are given a lot of tummy time because it helps them work on strengthening their neck muscles, which is really important for later physical milestones like sitting up and crawling. And when you put a baby on their tummy, that is typical, they are naturally inclined to lift up to see what's around them, right? Well, an infant that it has a visual impairment don't have that natural inclination to lift their head up off the ground. So you have to come up with different techniques to encourage them to do that. And it's really important that that starts in infancy because, like I said earlier, not working on strengthening those neck muscles is going to impact their later physical growth and development. On the other hand, my friend Nina talked about how vital it is to get early diagnosis so that her child could start receiving services right away. She had to go outside of the school system to obtain a diagnosis for her son for ADHD by a pediatric psychologist, which then she was able to take to the school to get him a 504 plan. But he still needed additional testing. The 504 plan does not provide, it provides him accommodations, but it doesn't provide him any individualized instructions. So she talked about how her son didn't get an IEP till he was in second grade, which delayed him receiving a lot of support that he needed up until that point. So since my assignment focuses on barriers educators face, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. One of the biggest barriers to inclusion is administrator support, right? And how those resources are allocated. So Erin explained that sometimes the support of students with disabilities need can be delayed or blocked because of school administrators who either lack the necessary resources or don't approve of the needed accommodations. And this challenge is echoed in that article, Equity Gaps for Students with Disabilities, which talks about how inconsistent funding and leadership changes make it really hard to implement inclusion effectively. Another challenge that Erin talked specifically about was the wealth gap in her students with disabilities. She provided me an anecdotal example of two students she had that required feeding therapy and feeding tubes. And one student was fed through a feeding tube and who needed feeding therapy, but that isn't provided in the school system. So in the school system, there are medical needs and then there are educational needs. The school is only required and obligated to provide educational support that a student will need to have access to their education. Feeding therapy is kind of put into the medical necessity. It's not an educational necessity. You can argue that you do have to feed children and they have to be nourished and not malnourished to be able to effectively receive their education. But as far as the school system is concerned, that is a medical need and that is not a service they are required to provide to children. She had these two students, and one student came from a wealthier family whose family ensured he received feeding therapy every single day, versus another child who did not. And the way that this impacted inclusion was eventually the child who received that feeding therapy was taken off a feeding tube and was able to eat lunch in the school cafeteria with the rest of the school. The other student never had that opportunity. So the wealth disparity really affected inclusion for those two children. And I found that to be a very powerful example, something that I didn't really think about. That was kind of hit really hard for me. And I, thought that, okay, so we understand this wealth disparity exists, and there's this difference between what is an educational support versus a medical support. And now, is there a way to bring those two together? How can we bring them together so that all students are receiving what they need to get to the inclusion piece of their education maybe a little bit quicker? Um, Obviously, she talked a lot about lack of training. There are some teachers who just don't have the training and aren't really willing to adapt to what they're used to. She did mention that younger, newer teachers tend to be a little bit more adaptable and more willing to take the required trainings or listen to suggestions and ideas from the special education teachers. So that was interesting to hear. She also talked about behavior management. It's a challenge. Teachers often have to juggle the academic needs of students along with their behavioral challenges. So this extra layer of complexity can make it harder to ensure all the students have, can access the curriculum fully. And then delay in pinpointing a disability. I mentioned how Nina talked about it took till second grade for them to figure out that her child had auditory learning disability. And then once they were able to pinpoint his disability, they were able to obtain an IEP for him, which provided him with the pull-out services to work on concepts that they were working on in the classroom, but one-on-one with the special educator. And this came, over 2 years after his ADHD diagnosis. And then she also talked about how parents often feel overwhelmed by the amount of information that they're given. And that can prevent them from advocating for their child's needs because they just don't know what to do with the overwhelming amount of information. And IEPs can also be challenging to comprehend for a lot of people. If you're not versed in them, it can be really hard and challenging to understand them. Equity in education is about ensuring every student gets the resources and support they need to succeed, no matter where they come from or what challenges they face. So this means recognizing that each student has different needs and making changes to the system to help close those gaps. So obviously providing individualized support to meet diverse needs. It includes early intervention starting from birth, if necessary, specialized instruction and accommodations. Erin talked a lot about how getting those necessary accommodation often means jumping through bureaucratic hoops, and teachers have to get creative sometimes because school administrators just don't have the resources. Many schools, especially those that are underfunded, just don't have what they need to ensure that each child receives an equitable education. And a lot of it ends up falling on those really special teachers who go out of the way to get the materials and supplies they need for these children. The article on the equity gaps of students with disabilities talks about how racial and social inequalities, they make it really hard for marginalized students to access special education services. My friend Nina, coming into this did not have any knowledge or information. She's a first-generation immigrant, and it's also not something that she had ever had to encounter or talk about in her family. And so a lot of times parents from disadvantaged backgrounds often face those extra challenges in navigating the system. There could be language barriers, there could be cultural barriers, which can lead to their children not receiving the services they're entitled to. And then Nina talked about how parents are vital in promoting equity. At first, she didn't know much about special education process, but once she learned, she became an advocate for her child. She encouraged other parents to connect with each other because that community support helped them navigate the system. So you hear something that worked from another parent and to try this. Oh, this didn't work for me. Or talk to this teacher, talk to this special ed teacher. They can help you figure out what might be the best fit for your child. Or, this teacher really was instrumental in my child's learning, and they can provide recommendations to other parents who might be struggling one of the things that was really interesting in my interview with both of them, I interviewed Erin first and then I interviewed Nina second. And I mentioned to Nina that I'm also interviewing Erin. And Erin teaches in the school district where my friend Nina's son attends. And it was fascinating to hear that when she started on this journey with her son many years ago, she actually ran into Erin at a school after having a meeting with her son's teacher about how he was struggling and then that they might need to get outside support for obtaining a diagnosis. Erin was the one who recommended the right school or a school and a teacher who she thought would really be beneficial to her son and what he was struggling with in the school. So it was kind of this really full circle moment. I wasn't aware of this. I had no idea that I'd ever met and had this conversation. So it was really special to hear about this educator who saw a parent struggling, didn't know her, just happened to run into her and provided her with the support she needed. Now, her son wasn't one of her direct students she worked with, right? But she was able to give her that comfort and support she needed at a very challenging time. And then when we talk about access in education, we're talking again about every student having the ability to fully participate in and benefit from what's being taught, right? So for some students, that means addressing their physical barriers. So like needing assistive technology, or for Erin students, needing materials in Braille. She had referred a student with visual impairment into one of our preschool programs, and we realized we are reading all these books and we have all these books in the library. We didn't have any Braille books. So we went out and purchased a ton of Braille books. So any book that was part of the lesson planning theme that we were going to be working on and reading for the whole week, we wanted to make sure that we had those same books in Braille. So then while the teacher is reading the books, that student was given the book with Braille. And you know what? The great thing was that all the students loved reading the books with the Braille as well. It can also mean, social barriers, or like struggling with behavior management, right? Erin talked a lot about mobility training, making sure children can orient themselves to their classroom and their environment. And a lot of times that means making the environment conducive and not having a lot of physical barriers that would make it challenging, not rearranging your classroom a lot, because that would disorientate a child with a visual impairment. And then obviously, making sure that we have appropriate classroom modifications and making sure that students like the ones Erin works with visual impairments can, make sure they're sitting in the front and they're not all the way in the back and can't see what's going on or what's being taught. And so my continued inquiry and what I want to know more about. I'm interested in learning more about teacher training and professional development. I want to know what kind of ongoing professional development is most effective. Are there specific programs or strategies that have been shown to help teachers better implement inclusive practices in their classrooms? I want to research that. I want to provide research-backed training for myself and my staff on inclusion in early childhood. I'd actually would love to have a day of inclusive practices training at my program. I think that would be really beneficial for all my teachers and for all the students that attend my program. I'm really curious and interested to know how schools prioritize resources for students with disabilities. I don't know really anything about that. So I'd be interested in exploring how resources are allocated, like specialized staff, assistive technologies, classroom aids, and whether these resources are adequate for teachers to implement inclusive education successfully. I want to know, what are the funding challenges schools face in supporting inclusive education? I think understanding financial barriers is really important. And I hope to accomplish that by speaking with school administration. And then through this course, a theme that has come up several times is how do we have people be more accepting of, inclusive practices? And it seems to be that community service learning has been a research-backed method of doing that. I'm interested in learning more about that and understanding why there aren't programs for this starting in elementary school. My children's school that they attend have they practice inclusion. They have classrooms that are self-contained, and then they have parts of the days where those students will come and spend time in a general education classroom. I would love to pilot a program at my kids' school that encourages full participation from their typical peers, where they go and spend meaningful, purposeful time interacting with their peers with disabilities. And I would be really interested to see the outcomes that come from that. The questions I'd like to pose for my peers is one of the things that Erin says is really, really beneficial to inclusion is collaborative teaching. And that means highly specialized, well-experienced, trained special educators fully collaborating with general education teachers. So how can schools encourage a culture of collaboration that supports the students with disabilities while also benefiting the peers? And then what can students, teachers, and parents do together to make the inclusion process more successful and impactful? That's it for my presentation. I hope you enjoyed learning as much as I have enjoyed learning about the barriers and challenges educators and parents face in the school system, specifically when it involves inclusion in the classroom. Thank you.